All right, now before we start working with our own grid, I want to look at the polysynth mainly so that we just understand what are some common components of a synthesizer. There's a lot of different types of synthesis, and I'm not really going to dive all that deep into it right now because ultimately I just want to create some relatively simple devices and then explore some unique ways that we can make them more colorful and add more character. So, the polysynth. Let me go ahead and arm this track, unarm my polygrid. I have my MIDI keyboard connected. All right. Now with the polysynth, this is a synthesizer that utilizes subtractive synthesis. And ultimately, all you really need to know about that, if you're not familiar, is that the sound is going to start from an oscillator. We have an oscillator that's going to generate some sort of waveform, a cyclical waveform. So that waveform just repeats indefinitely. And then the waveform is fed through a filter. When the audio is fed through the filter can remove certain frequencies. And this is where the subtractive nature of a subtractive synth comes from. But ultimately, we're thinking really about the signal flow. All right. The sound starts from an oscillator. With polysynth, there's actually two different oscillators I see here. The oscillator that I'll be able to hear is determined by this mix parameter. So right now, this is turned all the way to oscillator 1, which means I'm only hearing this oscillator. Now, like I said, the output of this oscillator is then fed through a filter. This filter lets me remove certain frequencies. Right now, this is set to a low pass filter, which means the low frequencies can pass through and the high frequencies are cut. So as I adjust the filter frequency knob here, I'm removing the higher frequencies and bringing them back. Okay. Now, typically after the filter, you would have some sort of volume envelope, an amplitude envelope. And I see right here it says AEG. And we have a knob that says A. This is for the attack, D is for the decay, S is for the sustain, and R is for the release. Ultimately, this allows us to shape the volume over time. This shapes the volume because this envelope is specifically related to the amplitude. That's what the A stands for. Now, you can have envelopes for all types of different parameters, and it'll allow you to shape that parameter as the note is being held down over the lifetime of the note. If I look above this where it says AEG, I actually see FEG. So this is an envelope specifically for the filter, where we can shape the filter as the note is being held down. Now, the main point is that we start with an oscillator, something that generates a sound. That sound is then being fed through a filter, which allows us to remove or shape the overall frequency response of the sound. From there, we have an amplitude envelope where we can shape the volume of the sound as the note is held down. So those are the three main components that we're looking at. And then from there, the sound has to be able to output from the device, right? So when I go back to my polygrid device up here, and let me just click in my little black box. What we start with in the polygrid, we start with an oscillator. This is our triangle oscillator. This is generating the triangle waveform. It's a cyclical waveform. It'll just repeat indefinitely. We see here that we have a volume envelope, and then we have our output here. One thing we're missing is a filter. If we wanted to get fancy, we can add yet another oscillator. I mean, we could add whatever that we want. But starting from scratch, we want to focus on trying to make more of a bass type patch. And having a filter available to us would be pretty helpful. So let's start diving into our own grid instrument and make this more of a bass patch.